Anybody have a chance? Let's see, who was here last week? Maybe I should ask that question. And what did we talk about? The importance of choice, right? We did talk about this, yes. But choice was the discussion. And the reason we started there is because a lot of Christians that I've talked to, I think in general, a lot of Christians think that there's no such thing. Choice doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter because God's got it all under control. But you can't get away from the biblical fact that you're still held responsible for choices, aren't we? And Carl and I were just talking about the fact that, sometimes we all know God's going to get from point A to point Z. He's going to get there because that's how he works. He's the sovereign one who decides the plan. But there's times where he comes and he offers you an opportunity to make a decision to participate in the plan. And you can say yes and receive blessing, or you can say no, and you know what God will do? He'll find somebody else. And then you just miss out on the blessing. But he's going to get to the point he wants to get to. And that's what we talked about last week. But it does not take away the fact that we have to make choices. And that our choices have consequences. Or they can have, blessings, depending on what we do. So we're going to keep into that line, and we're going to stop and talk about this one. I know this was a fun one today, right? You guys are all excited for this topic. Let's look at this. This is going to turn some people away right away because we don't like verses that don't fit what we like. But here's what Romans says. Paul tells the Roman people, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Can we strike that out of there? For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you'll receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So, now think of Paul writing this to the Romans, and you could have maybe the most ungodly rulers over them. Who are they? Who's in charge of the Romans? Caesar. We're not talking about, priests of God. We're not talking about Christians. We're talking about pagan, pantheon-worshipping Roman Caesars. And Caesar actually, some of them even thought they were divine. They thought they were a god. And how can he write this? Knowing all that. Sometimes bad, even ungodly people end up in a place of leadership. And here, Paul's telling them, what are we supposed to do? Reject them? Cast them off? Obey them. Now, we're going to open some cans of worms here, because there are times where the government's going to tell you to do something, or they're going to put a limitation on you that goes against the biblical truth. And now you're faced with a decision. Which priority? Who takes priority? Right. So there are times where the convictions of men and women, of people, will say, hey, this is not okay, that this is going on, and we're going to appeal to the authorities to change this. And if they don't, do they say, well, we tried, I guess we have to do what they want, or do we have to still follow God no matter what? Now, we forget that when they were deciding to, leave England, form the United States, the Declaration and so on, did they just decide to do that and have a war? Or did they try to appeal to them and say, these are the reasons we have a problem? How did they go about doing it? Just get guns and start fighting? No. They actually sent in their appeal with all of their complaints. You can go look it up. And they listed everything out. The taxes, they had all these things. They said, we're tired of these things, and we're asking that to change. And did it change? No. So it's not like they just decided to pick up guns one day and fight. They said, these are things, and they had biblical basis for it. Well, we feel that is not appropriate, and we've asked you to stop, and you won't. So we're going to have our own country. And did the British take that very well? No. And so they ended up having a battle over it. When we're speaking of government in general, Paul tells the people, you need to be subject to them. I know we don't like to hear that sometimes, but it is what it is. And there's purpose behind it. I'm going to show you here a few things in a second. So here's a question. What is the main purpose of government according to the verses we just read? I can go back to it. What's the main purpose of government?
To keep order and punish those who do wrong.
Yeah, there's really two key words, and these are going to be the ones that spark the discussion. Punish evil, reward good. Now, there's a couple words there that should jump out at you, okay? I'm going to put them up here. So, to punish evil is to protect the innocent from destruction, right? Protect people who are just trying to make their way and live their life from the bad stuff that could impact them. Reward good. Encouraging right behavior, right? Isn't that right? We reward good? Yep. So now, the problem is we have two words here that have to be defined. What are they? Good and evil. Can that change depending on who's writing the dictionary? This is where it goes south. Because if you have someone who says, I'm going to define evil a certain way, could it be bad? Could it actually be evil? Even though it's defined as good? Isn't that what Isaiah says? Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. In other words, there are going to be people who will define things opposite. And the question we should ask is, well, who gets to make that? You know, I kind of did that with my sermon last week. Who says? Who says we get to define this thing? Well, the person that's highest up, that has the highest authority, that has the most power, what do? They get to come in and they get to say, this is how we define good, this is how we define evil. And you better hope that they're good, right? Right. Are they always?
No.
Was Caesar always good?
No. Which one?
Yeah, which one? So the question is, why is the institution even necessary? I mean, it seems like every country, think about it, every country that has a government, even tribes, and they have a hierarchy of leadership. People have to enforce certain things. This is argued as maybe the earliest promotion of government. It might be a stretch, but you'll kind of see when we read the verse here. Here's what it says. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So what's happening here? Noah gets off the boat. He's told, you guys can actually eat meat now. Right? Before they were just eating vegetables. And they get off, and then he says, by the way, there's no killing. Like, you're not supposed to murder each other. No murder, okay? Because what's going to happen if you murder? What's he say here? You're killed. But you notice what he says here. He doesn't say, I'm going to take them out. He says, whoever sheds the blood of man, then what does he say? By man shall his blood be shed. So that suggests that there's some human beings that are going to have to enforce this rule. And so there's argument made that this is God's way of saying, maybe it was Noah, maybe it was people Noah picked, I don't know who it was. But this is the earliest form of, you're going to have some government to enforce the rule, thou shalt not murder, even though they haven't got the commandment yet. Don't murder, don't shed man's blood, because you're destroying my image when you do that. And there's going to have to be someone who can hold people accountable for that. So this may be the earliest statement regarding government that exists, because at this point it's just Noah and his family. That's it. There's another question. What happens if we abolish all government? I know there's people that would love that, right? Chaos. It's kind of like we can't win, right? You have government, it's going to end up getting you. If you get rid of it, you got chaos. It's like we're rocking a hard place, right? Judges 17:6. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So back at the time of the judges, when they didn't have an authority that they could say, this is the government, this is who's in charge, what did people do? Whatever they wanted. And that's not okay, because we all have different ideas of how things should go, don't we? And so chaos ensues. Anarchy ensues. Here's just a couple of examples. So in the days without a king, I went and read through a bunch of sections of Judges and the time that this was going on. And the tribe of Dan attacked and destroyed Laish to take a portion they wanted and think that what they had was good enough, so we're going to go in and take it for ourselves. So they went in and killed a lot of people and took the property. There was a man's concubine who was abused and then butchered, and he sent her parts to the different corners of Israel. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? Every one of these is over and over again. You see this statement, there was no king in Israel, so everybody did what they wanted. It says it I don't know how many times, at least 3 in these sections. So the writer is clearly trying to get us to understand there really is no universally accepted rule of law. It's just, if I have more power than you, it's kind of survival of the fittest, isn't it?
Pretty much.
Will the survival of the fittest work? It really, it does stuff. It does bring about the strongest to the top. But the problem with that is the strong person says, I want what you have, and what do?
Take it.
They just take it. And then somebody stronger comes along and likes what they have, they just take it. The best example of this, because he wrote about it in his biography, was Adolf Hitler. He believed in evolution and he believed in survival of the fittest completely. And so he believed that if the Jews, which are lesser, are a lesser people and I wipe them out, they have no reason, there's no right for them to exist because I'm the strong, they're the weak. The strong destroys the weak. Nature. He just appealed to nature. It was nature's way of doing things. In Judges 20, a war breaks out between the tribe of Benjamin and Israel, and they have a battle. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And every one of these, it's people were doing whatever they wanted in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel at the time. No king, no king. Even a bad king still had the idea of, I don't want to deal with anarchy and chaos because it would just consume all their time. They had objectives they wanted to accomplish to some degree. They wanted some kind of order. There it is again. Now look where we're at. Judges 21-25. We just went 4 chapters ahead. And in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You think the author wants us to understand that? What's the purpose of government? Well, they're supposed to set a standard and the rules for all people to follow. I mean, that's the purpose of coming and saying, if you do this, this is going to happen, right? Now, we don't agree with all these things. We don't like all these things. But they're supposed to set those standards and then enforce the standards. What was Paul's statement in Romans? They're supposed to reward when people do the right thing. And if you break the rules and you do what's wrong, you're going to have punishment, right?
Oh, yeah.
Now, notice I underlined and bolded and italicized this for emphasis. Should hold to a good standard of justice. Now, do they do that? No. Not all the time. But they should. And they should have an understanding of the next word. Good. We're going to talk about that in a second. All definitions of justice must appeal to a higher standard for their rightness. Do you realize that? If you can't appeal to something that is transcendent, higher authority than yourself, then where does that rule come from? Just you. It's just a matter of your opinion, isn't it? And that's kind of where we have started to teeter, isn't it? Where we have gotten to a point where if you take God out of the picture, the standard of rightness, who becomes the new standard of rightness? I mean, weren't we warned about this? Adam and Eve. What did the serpent say? You will not surely die. You will be gods. And so we said, perfect. We get to decide what's right and wrong. We get to make the rules. We're the ones who are in charge now. And so if we can eliminate God Almighty, we can step into the role and determine the rules. So the definitions of good and evil must be set and known for a government to do what's right. Because they are not the highest authority ever. They might be the highest authority in a land area, over a country, over a people, over a town, whatever. But they have to have something above them that they have to appeal to say, okay, this is where I'm getting my standard from. Now, if you think of Kersey, Kersey has authority over the town, right? They have government, but the state still has some control over what happens with Kersey, right? They can't just do everything. Some things they have to go to the state. And the states are kind of the way that the founders said they're the ones who have the ultimate authority, but they're going to come together. We need a federal government to make sure that their rights and that their power isn't infringed upon, right? But what happens when one of these groups gets so bold and power hungry that they say there's no one else to appeal to above us? That's when things, yeah. That's when things go south, right? When the government says we're going to fill in the role of highest authority and determine these good and evil definitions. Look what Nebuchadnezzar was told in Daniel 4. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness. Now, this is a pagan king. And what's Daniel telling him to do? Do what's right. And he says, your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed. Okay? And that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. In other words, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, I know that you're a pagan, you have your own gods, your own deities, but you are supposed to practice what's right and show mercy to those who are weak, basically, those who are being treated unfairly, the oppressed. This is what you're expected of. And on what authority can Daniel tell Nebuchadnezzar this stuff? He's a prophet of God. And he does not get a pass because he's a pagan king. And he has his own government. God's saying you still have responsibility. Here's Ecclesiastes 8. He says, Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity. And notice what he says here. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. So what's Solomon saying here? When there's evil done, there has to be an authority to come in and quickly bring apart the judgment, the punishment for that evil, or what will happen to people. It's going to spread. If you don't crush it, it's going to take over. And he says, I know exactly why that's the case, because the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. You think that we have forgotten in our society that the greatest evil that we have is not this external thing. It's right in here.
Right. Sure.
And if you start telling people that you're good, you're really good, you're not really bad, you're actually born good. Every good thing comes out of you. Everything you feel comes from a good place. So embrace it. What does that do to society? Yeah, it's just the opposite. God comes in and says, no, because of your parents, Adam and Eve, you were born inclined to evil. And so what do we have to do? Recognize that. And then you have to correct it. And in societies, who does that? Who's supposed to be the authority to say we recognize people are naturally, by birth, want to do what's wrong. So we have to set some rules here so that if they do these things, what are we going to do? Punish it quickly so that when people see the punishment, what will they do? Think, I don't want that. I think I'll not do that. But when you stop punishing, or you take forever to do it, what happens? People keep doing it. People keep doing it. It just grows. So at some point, you go through whatever means you can to do what? Put people in place who will do that, who will embrace the rules and say, we're going to quickly enforce them. So that society then will say, I'm not doing that thing because I don't want this consequence. Okay? We're going to talk about it here more in just a second. Do governments get it right all the time? I know this was a silly question. I recognize this was a silly question. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people think it's got to be perfect. Government's going to have to be perfect, or I'm not going to participate, or I'm not going to vote, or I'm not going to have anything to do with it. Good luck. If you want to find a church that's perfect, good luck. You're not going to end up anywhere. And I know people who don't go anywhere because there's a lot of churches that are not perfect. And so it's hard to deal with that. It gets discouraging, disheartening. And so the government's the same way. They're not perfect. Do they have a role? Yes. Do they have things, even just their existence? Think about the anarchy it keeps from just taking place and breaking out. Even if they're not great. Now, there's places in the country where we might do a little better. We wouldn't necessarily have the anarchy. But in general, there would be a lot of problems if they just didn't exist. So some things to just keep in mind. Governments, even though flawed, are established by God. That's what Paul says. That's what he told Nebuchadnezzar. That I know they may not be perfect, they're made up of human beings, but there's purpose. There's a reason they exist, because I'm in charge and I put them there. Here's what he says in Daniel 4:17. The sentence is decreed, this is what he tells Nebuchadnezzar, by the watchers, the decision, by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of men. So who gives it?
The Lord.
The Lord does. Now that goes back to kind of what we talked about last week. Do we really have any choice then? Yeah, we do. And a lot of times, God's honoring choices, isn't he? Governments are there to protect the people, not enrich themselves. That's a fundamental fact of government. Now, we may look at ours and go, oh boy, we have really gotten off track. We're talking about what ought to be, not what is. Okay? Today we're talking about biblically what ought to be. And the reason we're talking about this is because as we get closer to November, you're going to be faced with the decision of deciding which candidate on the ballot is closer to this. Is it going to be perfect? No way. No way. But you're going to have to say which one is closest to this, in my view, in what I've understood, and the fruit that they bore, and the things that they've done, and the policies that they've enforced. Which one? That's why I'm telling you what ought to be, not what is, because we would just have a complaining session if it was what is, right? We could make lists and lists. Look at this story. This is an interesting one. Ahab is the king right now. It says, now Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And after this, Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or, if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money. Let's think of the parties here. Naboth is the citizen. He's just a person who has property in the land. And who does Ahab represent? He's the government. He's the king. He is the one who's supposed to, ought to, enforce the law. But he has something he wants here. What does he want? He wants somebody's property. And so he even offers him, if you'll sell it to me, I'll give you something better, another location, or I'll just pay you for it. And Naboth says, oh yeah, sounds great. No, he doesn't say that, does he? But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And Ahab went into his house vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he had said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he lay down on his bed, and he turned away his face, and he would eat no food. What a big baby. Right? So the government comes in and says, do what we want you to do. We've given you some options. And he says, no, this is special. There's no amount of money. There's no other vineyard you can offer me to take my little portion of land that's been in my family forever. And the government, in this case, comes in and is not happy about it. He's not happy about it. And now there's some choices to be made. What can the government do? What can Ahab do?
Take it.
He can say, the rule is it's his land. That's the law. It's his land. And so I didn't like it. I'll go find another vineyard somewhere else. I guess I'll just have to walk a little further to my vegetable garden. He didn't do that, did he? I want that property. And so what does he do? Here's what happens. But his wife, Jezebel, came to him and said to him, why is your spirit so vexed and you eat no food? And he said to her, because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, give me your vineyard for money, or else if it will please you, I will give you another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. And Jezebel, his wife, said to him, do you not govern Israel? Now, she's not from Israel. Her dad was basically a priest in a foreign nation to a evil god. And so what does she say? Arise and eat bread and let your heart be cheerful, and I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she has all the authority of the government. Do you realize that? Ahab is the government. He governs Israel. And his wife has that authority as the first lady, I guess you could say. She has equal authority. And so she wrote letters in Ahab's name, put the government seal on them, sealed them with his seal, and she sent the letters to the elders and the leaders who lived with Naboth in his city. So the government gets involved. We didn't get the property we wanted, so we're going to take it ourselves. And so she wrote in the letters, proclaim a fast and set Naboth at the head of the people, and set 2 worthless men opposite him, and let him bring a charge against him, saying, you have cursed God and the king, then take him out and stone him to death. Sounds like a great governor leader, right? Great king. Well, he made some bad decisions here. So what did they do? They took him outside the city. They stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, Naboth has been stoned. He is dead. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, Jezebel said to Ahab, arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive, but dead. And as soon as Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite and take possession of it. What a terrible story, right? But it's not over yet. Now, before we go on. What's the government guilty of in this instance?
Murder.
They've murdered. What else? Theft. What else?
Did not protect.
They didn't protect. That's one of their roles.
False witness.
False witnesses, because what did you do? Find 2 worthless men and set them up so you can frame Naboth and he can get killed. So you have murder, you have theft, and you have false witness. 3 things right there that the government is guilty of. And do they get away with it?
Well,
Kind of, but not in the end. So here's what it goes on to say. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone to take possession of it. And you shall say to him, thus says the Lord, have you killed and also take possession? Notice how God's got this question. Did you murder and steal? And you shall say to him, thus says the Lord, in the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick your own blood. Now, this is the problem with governments, is they get this idea that they can do whatever they want because they're the highest authority, they think. Murder no longer is an issue. Theft no longer an issue. Setting people up so it looks like justice, but it's really a perversion of justice. Do they do these types of things? Every government has done this, probably. All of them. But did they get away with it? You have Elijah now, after maybe some time goes by, and God says, you have violated an authority, rule of law, that's higher than government. And God doesn't let that slide, does he? Every government, ultimately, will be accountable to who? How important is the rule of law? We're going to just set government aside for a second. How important is this, the rule of law? It's a discussion topic in our country today, the rule of law. It's fundamental, isn't it? It's the basics for society. To whom do the rules apply? You know how many times you flip the news on? No one is above the law. Have you heard that? No one is above the law. No one is above the law. No one's above the law. It usually gets quoted when somebody just violated the law.
well, when it's in their favor.
When it's in their favor, yeah, the law is great. What happens if there is no rule of law? Chaos. That's why governments are supposed to be intricately tied to what? The rule of law. And the rule of law actually is supposed to be more important than the government. It's actually the thing above government. Because law has to come from somewhere. It has to come from somewhere. What's in the Supreme Court? What do they have on the doors and on the walls? The 10 Commandments. Because there's no way to set a foundation on your law if you don't have something to root it in. And so where do they go to root it? The 10 Commandments. Because it's the only law. Everything comes back to it ultimately. But it's the only law they can appeal to that is not given by men. So you have to have something transcendent to appeal to for your rightness. Governments need it too. And when they start tearing that law down, what happens? It's just whatever you think.
It's mob rules.
Mob rules, popular rule. Yeah, we want people making decisions, right? Some do. And in some cases, we should. Good people who are thinking transcendent law and using that as their guide, those are the people you want making decisions, right? Because they're not appealing to themselves. Who are they appealing to? What's right, ultimately. Governments and their officials must be subject to the same laws.
Yes.
As if you can, yeah, I mean, that sounds like an obvious statement, right? It's really nice to make rules for other people to follow that you don't have to follow. Ahab and Jezebel, the government, they murdered, they stole, and they brought in false witnesses. They didn't follow their own rules, their own laws. This would have led to punishment for any other citizen. Do you realize that? However, Elijah made it clear they wouldn't get away with it before God. They had a terrible end, both of them. Because God says, I establish governments, and I've given them instructions on what to do. And when they don't do what they're supposed to do, I will hold them accountable. Here's a look at this one in 2 Samuel 11. It happened late one afternoon, when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? You guys know this story, right? He's up there walking around. His army is, battalions out there sleeping on the steps or out in battle. And he's at home, and he sees this, and he is the one who governs Israel. And so what does he do? He goes and he takes Uriah's wife. Commits adultery, which you could say, well, from a government standpoint, maybe that's outside their pay. But what did it lead to? He kills Uriah. So now you have the government killing a guy and taking his wife. Theft. You could probably make the argument it was theft to some degree. Now this is David, guys. This isn't Ahab. This is David. We have maybe the best king and maybe one of the worst, and yet they both are guilty of murder and theft. Why? Because the heart is desperately wicked, and it has to have something to keep it in check that is higher than it. Governments need this too. Now, the reason I even bring some of this up is because we can look at our current situation in politics as we approach an election. And my question is not who does the best job of following this, but who recognizes this. That's the question to ask yourselves. Is any of these candidates appeal to a higher authority than themselves? Or who's the closest, maybe you'd have to ask, or who seems to suggest that? You got to weigh that, because no one's going to get it right. None of them are going to be perfect and do exactly what they ought to do 100% of the time. But we do have to have a transcendent law that one of them, or hopefully the person we would vote for, would say, yeah, I believe there's a transcendent law that is higher than us, higher than government. So David took a man's wife because he was the authority and the power, committed murder, and yet he was considered maybe the greatest king in ancient history. So they're not always going to get it right. In both instances, the government broke the law. Whose law? God's law. Got broken. The law breaking led to the destruction of those whom they were charged with protecting. When the government doesn't follow the law, people get hurt. We all have seen that. God would hold them accountable for these mistakes. Ahab gets slaughtered. What happens to David? He doesn't die in the streets like that. His son does have some consequences. But he does. And he also, though, has a different heart, though.
He was repentant.
When he does make mistakes, what does he say? In fact, remember, Nathan shows up at his door and says, I got a story about a guy who had a little sheep. Remember the lamb story? And he says, I'm going to take this guy's lamb. It's the only lamb he has, and it's going to become mine. And he goes, that guy's going to pay. And then he says, you're the guy, David. And David goes, oh my goodness. And in that moment, it comes to his senses, and he realizes, I've sinned not against, he doesn't even say against Uriah. He says, I sinned against you, Lord. So whose law did he break? And he recognized it. And that's important to recognize, is that there is a instance where God will, he even says, blessed is the man who God doesn't hold a sin against him. The rule of law is foundational to any nation. Any nation. And the rule of law has to come from beyond humanity. Has to. Because otherwise, it's only a matter of opinion. It's only a matter of survival of the fittest. Whichever government is the strongest and has the most weapons and the biggest military and the most guns, they're the ones who get to make the rules. We've always heard that. That's how it works in a survival of the fittest mindset. And the problem is when governments get lots of guns and lots of power and lots of money, they start to say, I don't answer to anybody. I make the rules how I want them to be. And that doesn't go well, does it? So the rule of law has to be above. How would I know if the government made a good law? I mean, just thinking about all the laws that are passed, how do you go home and you flip on the news or you read this and you go, okay, they just passed this law in D.C. I think that's a good law. I think that's a bad law. You have to have something to define that. What do you use?
The handbook, the Bible.
That's right. That's what we should be using because there's nothing else to go off of. Otherwise, it's just a matter of opinion, right?
Yeah.
So I think, that gives me what I want, good law. But it doesn't matter what I want. I mean, to some degree, that's how we vote, isn't it? So there's some laws, maybe that's an example of something that you could make. You could say, let's put that on the ballot. We're going to turn 34 into 90 miles an hour. And some people are going to say, that's awesome. I can get to Greeley a lot faster. Yes.
Maybe.
Maybe, depending. The traffic's gotten bad. No, bad law. And you have to have some basis for that. And one thing we can do here is we can try to change the law by voting, by getting involved in the process. If you don't like what's happening, I mean, what did the founders do? They said, we're not going to sit by and just vote. We're going to get involved. People have been doing that for hundreds of years, right? A couple hundred years in our country. The beauty for us is if we don't like it, we can vote. Rule of law exists in a written document governing all by the same rules. Does that sound familiar? The Ten Commandments might be one. Do we have another one? We do. It's called the Constitution. And what's crazy is the founders, surprise, surprise, thought, what we should have? Something written down that has the fundamentals that everyone will abide by. Wonder where they got that idea. Something that is written. There's no person. It's written. We've agreed these are the words, these are the languages. It's handed down and everybody's going to follow this. All of us, everybody. They all agreed to it. And so it becomes the standard by which everything else must adhere to. Thankfully they did. I think they did a pretty good job using biblical principles to do these things. It may not have been thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not in the Constitution, but they had to, when they were preparing that, figure out what do we put in here? What are the good things that we should put in here? And what bad things should we restrict? And what did they put in there? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You have your amendments. You have your rights to certain things. Because those were biblical principles. They had to appeal to a higher power than themselves to figure out what they should put in their Constitution, right? So what did they use? Probably the Bible, number one. And second, history. What doesn't work? Other places. We're not doing that, Or we're just escaping that. We don't want to put that in here. So in the Ten Commandments for Israel, now I put the world here because Israel got the Ten Commandments, but does God's law go throughout? Did Nebuchadnezzar get the Ten Commandments? No. But did he know? Because what God told him, you're supposed to rule with righteousness and you're supposed to have mercy. So even though he wasn't subject to Israel's law in the Ten Commandments, God expected him to understand what right was. Laws created and implemented are supposed to be for the good of the nation, not for any one person or ruler. It's to keep the country from spiraling into chaos and anarchy. And the authorities should enforce those rules to keep anarchy from ensuing, 100%. So let's just take a couple topics real quick and see how these might interact with this idea of rule of law. Okay, I recognize these may be controversial. BLM and the Antifa riots. Remember this? Burning cities down? Okay. They may have thought they were just in their efforts, regardless of what they thought, right? The question is not whether they thought they were. Were they under the rule of law?
No.
Do you have under the law a right to come in and burn someone's business down for any reason?
No.
Okay. So if there is a rule of law, you can't destroy someone else's property. You can't take their stuff. That's our bell. We're done? No. If you can't do those things, what's the government's responsibility when they happen? Remember what Ecclesiastes said? You got to do it fast, or what's going to happen? It's going to spread. Did it spread when that stuff was going on? It just took over the country in a lot of ways, didn't it? And again, it's because we have a law. If you want to appeal to some issue, what's the best way to do it? You want to go through the process the best you can, isn't it? So you don't really take yourself out in the process. If you go and you burn somebody's business down, they're not going to listen to you. They're going to be against you. If you think you've got some issue, you should make an appeal. You should raise support. You should go about it in the peaceful, right manner is the best way you can so that you can't be held or charged with evil, even if your position may be wrong. But what happened in these cases? They came in, they tore stuff up, they burned places down, destroyed a bunch of areas in the country. And the thing is not so much them. I mean, that we can say probably universally it was not a good idea to do those things. It was bad. But the governments who we're talking about, what was their job?
Shut it down and they didn't.
They didn't stop it. And so it spreads.
They forgot to protect the nation.
Isn't that fundamental? They're supposed to reward good, punish evil. It's evil to burn somebody's business down.
Well, you could,
I know that's a topic.
there's no such thing as illegal anyway.
And again, this is not an issue of peoples, groups, or persons. What's the rule of law say? Remember, we're having to appeal to something higher than any person or group or individual. There has to be a law. And again, you can make an argument that governments make laws that are bad. If a government says, listen, this is how you have to come into a country, there's really not a Bible verse on that. Is there? Does God give governments some ability to make decisions that don't really have a direct tie to something in the Scripture? Yeah. Driving on 34 at 65 miles an hour. That's not a biblical verse. There's no verse I can say, hey, you can't do that. So if they come in and say, listen, in order to make sure that we know who's coming in here to protect our country, we're going to make a law that says you can't just come in any way you want. You have to go through a process. Now, we could argue about how bad the process is, but I'm talking about the law itself. The rule of law says what? You have to come in by following these rules. And so anybody that says, no, I don't agree with that, I think you should just be able to come in. However, you can get here. We have to ask the ultimate question of where does the rule of law play? I think it's, again, I understand people want to come and I think it's awesome. Like, come here because this is a land of opportunity. Absolutely. But where do we go with the rule of law in that? What place does it hold in the process of coming here? Or going somewhere else in another country? If you wanted to go to Canada or you wanted to go to anywhere, any country and move in there, is there a rule of law? It may even be different than America's laws or others, but there's still a rule of law that has to be followed. And so how important is the rule of law? So as a voting citizen, if they're not enforcing the rule of law, and the rule of law is an important biblical issue, because it is the fundamental to societies without anarchy, then voters have to say, I have to vote for rule of law. It may not be perfect. It may not be exactly what I want. But if you have candidates, where do they stand on rule of law? And look at the laws that are on the books, like the ones that we know definitively they're good laws because they have a biblical standard. Okay, and then maybe the ones that you're like, I don't know where I stand on that. But think about the big ones. Rule of law, following the rules. Where do they stand on that? Can they violate whenever they want? Do they think they can just break it whenever they want? So you have to ask the question, which person do I vote for who is going to maybe they're not going to do it perfectly, but they are for the rule of law. I want to show you this. Because we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, there it is, unbridled by morality and religion, various, ambitious, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whole goes through a net, as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. In other words, if you're going to allow voting, I agree with you. If you're going to allow voting, you let a bunch of evil people vote, you're going to get evil. If we all voted God's interest, from a biblical standpoint, we just said, I don't really care what benefits me. What would God want for this situation? How would the country be different? Would it be different? And I think the founders had in their mind that if moral people who really held to the view that life, the human value of a person, and the rule of law under God's law was the ultimate, and they held that above everything else, then that would guide their decision making, even though they're wicked people. They had something that they appealed to say, this is why this is right. Doesn't make it a perfect process. I agree with you. And when we all vote how we want, and there are some things they're divided on because we vote however we want, but ultimately, if we voted how God wanted, how would society be?